What would you do if the world had taken everything from you? Your family, your home, your future, and left you with nothing but the clothes on your back and $3 silver in your pocket? For 19-year-old Rose Harding, this wasn't a question. It was the sharp, cold truth of a Tuesday morning in the Wyoming Territory. She arrived in the dusty settlement of Redemption Gulch, with the ghosts of her parents at her back and the weight of a foreclosed farm in her heart. A place where she was a stranger to everyone, including the person she was forced to become. That same day, she bought a dead trapper's mountain lodge for those $3, a property the entire county called a ruin and a curse. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten cabin, buried under years of dust and solitude, was a legacy of intention, a gift left behind by a man who knew precisely what it meant to have nothing, and who had decided to give everything to the next soul who was brave enough to claim it. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who bought a ghost's home and found a future. The dust of the high plains had worked its way into the very weave of Rose's worn calico dress. It was a fine, pale powder that spoke of long roads and no rain, a constant reminder of the farm she'd lost, where the soil had turned to this same unforgiving grit before the bankman came. She stood before the sheriff's office in Redemption Gulch, a town that felt less like a place of salvation and more like a final stop. Her gaze was fixed on a notice nailed to the weathered wood, a list of county properties to be auctioned for back taxes. Most were barren quarter sections, dismissed with a single line. But one entry held her attention, scrawled in hurried ink at the bottom of the page: the Blackwood parcel. Approximately 40 acres with structure, high valley, no access road. She remembered the name. Old Man Blackwood, a trapper who had gone up into the Rattlesnake Mountains 20 years ago and never came back down. Folks said the mountain had swallowed him whole, that his lodge was just a pile of bones and rotten logs now, haunted by the wind. Her hand went to the small leather pouch tied at her waist. Inside, $3 clicked against each other. It was the last of the money her mother had sewn into the hem of her own dress, a final, desperate provision for a future she would never see. The fever that had taken her father in the spring had returned for her mother in the summer, leaving Rose with nothing but a silent house and a stack of debts. The auction was in an hour. It was a fool's errand, a desperate grasp at a splinter of hope. But a splinter was more than she had. She had spent the last of her strength just getting here, walking beside a freight wagon for the last 50 miles, trading mending the driver's canvas for scraps of salt pork and hardtack. Her body ached with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. She wasn't just tired, she was worn through, like a rope frayed down to its last thread. The memory of her father's hands, calloused and kind, showing her how to set a fence post, rose in her mind. "Find good ground, Rosie," he used to say. "Land with water and high rock to break the wind. The rest is just work." Perhaps this was that ground, or perhaps it was just another dead end. But for $3, she had to know. The auction took place in the dusty clearing between the saloon and the livery stable. A crowd of men in sweat-stained hats and sturdy boots had gathered, their faces hardened by sun and wind. They were ranchers, prospectors, and merchants, men who understood the value of land in board feet and grazing rights. A stout, red-faced auctioneer stood on the back of a wagon, his voice a booming drum against the vast, indifferent sky. Rose stood at the edge of the crowd, small and still, trying to be invisible. She listened as parcels of land were sold for hundreds of dollars, vast tracts of prairie that would soon be scarred by barbed wire. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat and smirked. All right, folks, last lot of the day. A real prize for the ambitious man. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The old Blackwood place, 40 acres of rock and pine, comes with a complimentary ghost and a squirrel for a neighbor. Who'll start the bidding at $1 for the timber rights? A large man with a florid face and a silver watch chain gleaming against his vest raised a hand. Silas Croft, the wealthiest rancher in the county, a man known for buying up land and stripping it bare. $1, Croft boomed, his voice thick with contempt. He wasn't bidding on a home. He was bidding on firewood. The auctioneer looked around, a performative scan of the crowd. $1 it is. Going once. A voice, quiet but clear as a bell in the sudden hush, cut through the air. $2. Every head turned. Rose felt 100 pairs of eyes land on her, a sudden heavy weight. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on the auctioneer. Silas Croft stared at her, his eyes narrowing in disbelief before his face broke into a wide, mocking grin. Well, I'll be, he chuckled, turning to the man next to him. Looks like we got a real land baroness in our midst. The crowd snickered. The auctioneer, flustered for a moment, regained his rhythm. The little lady bids 2, do I hear 3? Croft, enjoying the spectacle, raised his hand again. $2.50, he said, drawing out the words, his tone dripping with condescending amusement. He was playing with her now, trying to humiliate her. Rose took a breath, the dust filling her lungs. She reached into her pouch, her fingers closing around the 3 coins. They felt both heavy and insignificant, the sum total of her worldly existence. $3, she said, her voice not wavering. A complete silence fell over the clearing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Croft's smile vanished. He stared at her, a flicker of genuine anger in his eyes. He could have bid 1,000, but the game was no longer fun. To be challenged, even in jest, by a slip of a girl with nothing to her name was an insult. He gave a dismissive shake of his head and turned his back. The auctioneer, seeing his patron was done, moved quickly. $3, going once, going twice, sold. To the young lady in the faded dress, for $3. The sharp crack of the gavel sealed it. She had just bought a ghost's home on a forgotten mountain. What could possibly be waiting in that derelict lodge that an entire town had dismissed as worthless? What secret did the mountain hold that the old trapper, Silas Blackwood, had taken with him to the grave? And what force of will drives a person, pushed to the very edge, to bet their last dollar not on a meal or a room for the night, but on a piece of forgotten earth? Let us know what you believe she will find in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. For Rose Harding, the mocking laughter of the crowd was already fading, replaced by the daunting silence of the journey that now lay ahead of her. The county clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, peered at Rose over the rims of his glasses as he filled out the deed. His pen scratched across the paper, the sound loud in the quiet office. He didn't say anything, but his expression was a mixture of pity and disbelief. He took her $3 silver without comment, dropping them into a metal box with a dull thud. He slid the deed across the counter. "It's yours, miss," he said, his voice flat. "Can't say what you've bought other than trouble. There's no road past the old Miller Creek. You'll have to walk the last 5 miles. Rose simply nodded, her fingers tracing the elegant script of her own name on the document. Rose Harding. For the first time in months, Her name was tied to something other than loss. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her dress. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, a shadow fell over her. An old woman stood there, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her black hair streaked with silver and tied back with a leather cord. She was Arapaho, her clothes a mix of worn buckskin and traded cloth. The townspeople gave her a wide berth, but her eyes, dark and intelligent, held no malice. She reached out a hand, not to ask for anything, but to gently touch Rose's arm. "The mountain chooses who belongs on it," the woman said, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together in a riverbed. "Not the auction man." Then, just as quietly, she was gone, melting back into the alleyways of the town. The words hung in the air, a strange and cryptic blessing. Rose's next stop was the livery stable. She needed a way to carry the few supplies she could afford. The owner, a stooped man named Jed, looked her up and down. "Heard you bought the Blackwood place," he said, not unkindly. "Croft's none too happy." "I didn't do it to spite him," Rose replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Jed chewed on a piece of straw, considering her. He saw not a fool, but a girl with the same desperate grit he'd seen in 100 other pioneers who had passed through this town. Most failed. A few, the stubborn ones, held on. He jerked his head toward a pen at the back. "Got an old mule, Jasper. He's half blind in one eye and mean as a snake, but he's strong. $10. Rose's shoulders slumped. "I don't have it." Jed was silent for a long moment, then sighed. "Tell you what, you take him. And you take that sack of oats. When you get settled, you find a way to pay me back. Maybe you find some ginseng up there, or you trap a few good pelts. I'll take it in trade." It was an act of such unexpected kindness that tears pricked at Rose's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry. "Thank you," she managed to say. Just then, Silas Croft's voice boomed from the doorway. "You giving charity to fools now, Jed?" He strode in, his expensive boots loud on the packed earth floor. He stopped in front of Rose, looking down at her. "You bought yourself a pile of rotten logs and a view of your own foolishness, girl. That mountain will chew you up and spit you out before the first snow. Blackwood was a better man than you'll ever be, and it killed him." Rose met his gaze, her own steady and quiet. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply turned, took the lead rope for the mule, and walked out of the livery, leaving Croft standing in a cloud of dust and his own impotent fury. The weight of the town's scorn was heavy on her back, but the cryptic words of the old woman echoed in her mind, a quiet counterpoint to Croft's loud derision. The journey began at dawn the next day. Rose led the old mule, Jasper, out of Redemption Gulch, her few provisions, a bag of flour, a side of salt pork, a small axe, and the sack of oats, strapped to his back. The town was still asleep, the windows of the buildings like closed eyes. She didn't look back. The trail leading up into the Rattlesnake Mountains was little more than a game path, winding through stands of aspen and ponderosa pine. For the first few hours, the world was alive with the sounds of the waking wilderness, the chatter of squirrels, the distant call of a hawk. But as she climbed higher, a deep silence began to settle. The air grew thinner, cooler, and carried the clean, sharp scent of pine and damp earth. This was a different world from the flat, sun-baked plains she had known her whole life. Here, the land was vertical, immense, and watchful. Jasper, despite his age and bad eye, proved to be a steady companion. He picked his way over the rocky ground with a sure-footed patience, his one good eye fixed on the path ahead, his ears swiveling to catch every sound. Rose walked beside him, her hand often resting on his sturdy neck. They were two solitary, stubborn creatures, moving slowly toward an unknown future. They followed the directions the liveryman had given her, tracking the course of a fast-running creek until it disappeared into a tangle of willows. This was the place the clerk had warned her about, the end of any discernible road. From here, she was on her own. For the rest of the day, she pushed through dense undergrowth, the mule following her without complaint. The sun began to dip below the high peaks, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. A profound sense of isolation washed over her. There was no sign of human life, no distant curl of smoke, no sound of a barking dog. There was only the wind sighing through the pines and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She was tired, her muscles burning with an ache that went bone deep, but she couldn't stop. She had to reach the lodge before dark. Just as the last light was fading from the sky, casting the valley in a deep blue twilight, she saw it. Through a break in the trees, perched on a wide ledge overlooking the valley, was a cabin. It was smaller than she had imagined, and more derelict. The roof sagged deeply in the middle, a section of the porch had collapsed, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye, a stone chimney covered in moss, listed to one side as if weary of standing. It looked less like a home and more like a grave marker. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. Croft had been right. The town had been right. She had spent her last $3 on a ruin. She had walked all this way for a pile of rotten logs. She slumped against a tree, the exhaustion of the past weeks finally overwhelming her. Jasper nudged her gently with his nose, his warm breath fogging in the cool evening air. He let out a low, rumbling sigh, as if to say, "Well, we're here now. Let's get on with it." His simple animal presence was a comfort. She straightened up, took a deep breath of the mountain air, and walked the final 100 yards to her new home. The door hung crookedly on one leather hinge. She pushed it open, the sound of groaning wood echoing in the stillness. The inside was a single room, dark and thick with the smell of dust, cold ash, and something else. Something clean and resinous, like freshly split pine. Rose slept that first night just outside the cabin door, wrapped in her thin blanket, with Jasper tethered nearby. She didn't trust the sagging roof, and the darkness inside the single room felt too absolute, too full of the old trapper's long absence. She lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the high country. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the underbrush, the immense breathing silence of the mountain itself. She watched the stars emerge, impossibly bright and close in the thin air, a glittering canopy strewn across the blackness. They were the same stars that had shone down on her family's farm, but here they felt different, older and more watchful. She finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams a jumble of her mother's fading face and Silas Croft's mocking laughter. She woke at first light, stiff and cold, to a world washed in pale gray. The valley below was filled with a sea of mist, making her ledge feel like an island in the sky. Her first task was to assess the cabin in the clear light of day. It was as bad as she had feared, but also not. The log walls, though gray with age, were massive and settled, the chinking crumbling but the structure itself seemingly sound. The roof was the main problem, a gaping hole letting in the sky. But as she walked around the small structure, she began to notice things that didn't fit with the narrative of abandonment and decay. Behind the cabin was a lean-to for firewood. Its roof had collapsed under the weight of some past snow, but underneath the tangle of rotten timbers, the woodpile was perfectly stacked. Not just thrown in a heap, but carefully arranged by size. The kindling separate from the larger logs, all of it seasoned and dry. It was the work of a patient, methodical man. No one who was simply abandoning a place would leave behind such a perfect woodpile. Near the crooked stone chimney, she found a small spring, the water bubbling up cold and clear from between two mossy stones. A channel had been dug, lined with flat rocks, to guide the overflow away from the cabin's foundation. It was a simple, clever piece of engineering, designed to last. It was still working. Then she saw the axe. It was stuck in a large stump that served as a chopping block. She expected it to be a rusted, useless thing, but when she pulled it free, the head was heavy and perfectly balanced. The blade was wrapped in a carefully oiled piece of leather. She unwrapped it. The steel beneath was clean, sharp enough to shave with. A film of protective grease covered the edge. This wasn't the tool of a man who had fled in a hurry or died unexpectedly. This was the tool of a man who had put it away at the end of a day's work, fully intending to pick it up again the next morning. A deep, unsettling feeling crept over her. This place wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The dismissal and mockery of the townspeople seemed suddenly hollow, a story told by people who had never bothered to climb this high, to look this closely. Something here was wrong, a quiet detail that refused to fit the simple story of a dead trapper and his ruined cabin. The mountain was silent, but the works of the man who had lived here had begun to speak. The first week was a blur of relentless labor. Rose's life narrowed to a simple, brutal rhythm. Wake at dawn, work until dusk, fall into an exhausted sleep. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, quickly became raw, then healed into a tougher, thicker hide. She focused on the essentials. First, the roof. Using the sharp axe Blackwood had left, she felled 2 young, straight pines. Stripping the branches was grueling work, but the clean, sharp scent of the sap was invigorating. Getting the new ridgepole into place was a puzzle of leverage and sheer will. She used a fallen log as a ramp and the patient, steady strength of Jasper the mule, urging him forward one step at a time until the heavy timber slid into its notch atop the walls. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. She spent 3 days splitting shakes from a fallen cedar, her arms and back screaming in protest, until she had enough to patch the gaping hole. Her work was clumsy, not as neat as the original builders, but it was solid. It would hold. She moved inside, clearing out the years of accumulated dust and debris. The room was spare, containing only a rough-hewn table, a single chair, a bed frame made of pine logs lashed together with rawhide, and a stone hearth that took up most of one wall. As she worked, more clues to Silas Blackwood's character emerged. Tucked away in a small pantry, she found tin canisters, sealed with wax. Inside, the contents were perfectly preserved. Flour, beans, salt, even coffee. On shelves, there were neatly bundled dried herbs, each tied with twine and labeled with a small carved wooden tag: yarrow, mint, willow bark. This wasn't just a trapper's hovel, it was a home built with foresight and care. Every object she touched seemed to tell a story of the man who had lived here. His tools, which she found in a small chest, were not just functional. They were beautiful in their simplicity and evidence of meticulous care. Each chisel was honed, each saw blade was sharp and oiled, Each handle was worn smooth by the grip of a single knowing hand. He had left everything. Traps of all sizes were cleaned and bundled, hanging from pegs on the wall. Snowshoes, their gut webbing still taut, leaned in a corner. A stack of tanned deer and beaver hides, soft and supple, were folded neatly on a shelf. It was a fortune, a complete kit for surviving and thriving in this wilderness. Why would a man leave all this behind? The question echoed in the quiet cabin as she worked. Her silent companion through it all was Jasper. The old mule would stand tethered just outside the door, his one good eye watching her, his ears flicking at flies. She talked to him as she worked, her voice a low murmur that was less for him and more for herself, a way to fill the immense silence. She told him about her family, about the farm, about the ache of loneliness that was a constant companion. The mule would just listen, occasionally giving a soft snort or a flick of his tail. He was a steady, grounding presence, a link to the world of living, breathing things. One evening, as she was repairing the chinking in the wall near the hearth, mixing mud and dried grass with her bare hands, she felt a loose log. It wasn't rotten, but it shifted slightly under her touch. It was one of the foundation logs, notched and fitted with the others, but something felt different about it. Curiosity piqued. She pressed harder. It moved. The man who built this place did nothing by accident. Every piece of his life here spoke of intention. This loose log was no different. The discovery came on a cold, clear afternoon, 2 weeks after her arrival. The air had a new crispness to it, a warning of the coming autumn. Rose had been working on the hearth, resetting some of the loose stones with fresh clay mortar. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the log near the base of the wall, the one that felt different. She had left it alone, focusing on more urgent repairs, but it nagged at her. Now, with the chimney solid and drawing cleanly, she turned her attention back to it. She ran her hands along its length, feeling for a seam, a latch, anything. There was nothing. It was just a log, seemingly identical to the others, yet it had shifted. She fetched a small pry bar from Blackwood's tool chest. Carefully, she worked the tip into the tiny gap between it and the log above. She put her weight on it. With a low groan of wood against wood, the log didn't just move, it swung inward. It wasn't a foundation log at all. It was a cleverly disguised door, a small, hidden compartment built into the wall behind the warmth of the hearth. Her heart began to beat faster. She knelt, peering into the dark space. The air that came out was cool and dry, smelling of old paper and leather. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against a small metal box. She pulled it out. It was a simple tin lockbox, not much bigger than a book, heavy for its size. It wasn't locked. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dried lavender, was a small, worn, leather-bound journal, an oilskin pouch, and a single polished river stone, smooth and gray and perfectly shaped to fit in the palm of a hand. She picked up the stone first. It was strangely warm, as if it held some residual heat from the man who had placed it there. She set it aside and opened the oilskin pouch. Inside were not coins or gold, but seeds. Dozens of small paper packets, each folded and marked with precise, neat handwriting. Carrot, bean, squash, high-altitude corn. There was also a larger packet labeled Wildflower Mix for the bees. It was a hidden garden, a promise of future springs. Finally, she picked up the journal. The leather was soft with age. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as on the seed packets, clear and strong. It began not with a date, but with a title, a letter to the one who comes after. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a journal. It was a message. She began to read. If you are reading this, it began, then you have found my home, and I hope you are in greater need of it than the world that will have forgotten me. My name is Silas Blackwood. I am not dead, not in the way the town will tell it. I am simply finished. He wrote of his life, of coming to this mountain as a young man, full of anger and grief after losing his wife and young daughter to cholera back east. He wrote of how the mountain had healed him, how the patient work of building a life from nothing had quieted the storm in his soul. He had built this cabin, hunted these woods, and lived in solitude for 30 years. But he was old now, his bones aching with the cold, and he knew his time was short. I have no kin, he wrote, and I will not have my life's work, this small sanctuary, sold for timber to a man like Croft, who sees trees but not the forest. I have paid the taxes forward for 5 years. I am leaving it all behind, not out of carelessness, but with purpose. Everything here, the tools, the traps, the food, the knowledge in this book, is a single inheritance. It is not for the rich or the powerful. It is for the person who has nothing left, the one who comes to this place not to take from it, but to ask for shelter. It is for a soul with the grit to make the climb and the eyes to see the value in what others have dismissed. Rose's vision blurred with tears. The final pages of the journal were a guide to the mountain, where to find the best fishing holes, how to read the weather in the clouds, which berries were safe to eat. It was a lifetime of wisdom, passed on in a final extraordinary act of faith. He had not abandoned his home. He had curated it. He had left it for her. The first snow came early that year, a sudden violent blizzard that descended from the high peaks without warning. One moment, the sky was a bruised purple. The next, the world had dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The wind howled around the small cabin, a mournful, hungry sound, tearing at the new shakes on the roof. But they held. Inside, Rose stoked the fire in the newly repaired hearth. The stones radiated a deep, steady warmth, and the cabin, once a derelict shell, was now a snug and sturdy refuge against the storm's fury. She had spent the past month following the instructions in Silas Blackwood's journal, laying in provisions. The small pantry was full, the woodpile was high, and the cabin was banked with earth and pine boughs to keep out the drafts. She felt a quiet sense of preparedness, a feeling she hadn't known since before her parents' death. She was listening to the storm rage when she heard it, a faint cry, nearly lost in the wind. She froze, straining to listen. It came again, closer this time, a desperate human shout. Her heart leapt into her throat. No one should be out in this. Pulling on the heavy wool coat she had found in Blackwood's chest, she grabbed a lantern and stepped out into the blizzard. The force of the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. "Hello," she yelled, her voice snatched away by the gale. A weak reply came from the direction of the trail. Shielding the lantern with her body, she fought her way through the deepening snow. She found them huddled in the lee of a massive boulder, a man, a woman, and a young boy, their faces pale with cold and fear. They were strangers, their clothes inadequate for the mountains. Their horse had gone lame, and they had been trying to reach Redemption Gulch on foot when the storm hit. "The preacher," the man gasped, introducing himself as Mr. Evans. "My wife, Sarah, and our son, Thomas." Rose didn't waste time with questions. "My cabin is close," she said, her voice firm and calm. "You can shelter there." She helped the woman, who was shivering uncontrollably, to her feet, while Mr. Evans carried his son. They stumbled through the blinding snow, guided by the small, steady flame of Rose's lantern. When they finally stepped into the warmth of the cabin, their relief was so profound, it was almost painful to watch. Sarah Evans burst into tears. Rose settled them by the fire, wrapping them in the soft, tanned deerskins Blackwood had left behind. She heated a pot of bean soup on the hearth, the smell filling the small room. As they ate, their story came out. They were new to the territory, heading to a congregation in the next valley, and had completely misjudged the mountain weather. "We would have died out there, Mr. Evans said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." Rose simply shook her head. "The mountain provides," she said, echoing a phrase from Blackwood's journal. "I'm just the steward of this place." For 3 days, the blizzard raged. The Evans family and Rose shared the small cabin, their lives intertwined by the storm. She shared her food, her warmth, her shelter, all the things Silas Blackwood had left behind. She told them about the trapper, about his letter, about his incredible gift. Mr. Evans listened, his eyes wide with wonder. He saw not a foolish girl who had bought a ruin, but a young woman of incredible strength and grace, living in a place that was not haunted, but blessed. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was transformed. Buried under a thick blanket of pristine snow, the sky a brilliant, aching blue. The test had come, and she had passed it, not just by surviving, but by extending the trapper's legacy of shelter to others in need. When the snows had melted enough for travel, the Evans family made their way down to Redemption Gulch. The story they told spread through the town like wildfire. They spoke of a girl living alone on Blackwood's mountain, not in a ruin, but in a snug, well-provisioned cabin. They spoke of her courage during the storm, of the food she shared, of the warmth of her hearth. They described a place not of ghosts and decay, but of quiet competence and profound peace. The townspeople who had laughed at her began to speak her name with a new tone, one of grudging respect that slowly softened into awe. Silas Croft heard the stories and scoffed, dismissing them as the exaggerations of grateful travelers. But the narrative had shifted. Rose Harding was no longer the town fool. She was the girl who had tamed Blackwood's folly. A few weeks later, Dr. Miller, the town physician, rode up the trail, ostensibly to check on the remote homesteader after the harsh winter. He found Rose splitting wood, the movements of her body strong and sure. He saw the solid roof, the clean chimney, the healthy-looking mule grazing nearby. He accepted her offer of a cup of coffee, brewed from Blackwood's own stash, and sat at the sturdy table. "The town's been talking," he said, his voice kind. "They said you were thriving up here. I see they weren't wrong." He looked around the cabin, at the neatly organized tools, the bundled herbs, the sense of order and purpose. "This is remarkable, Miss Harding." Rose just nodded, a faint blush on her cheeks. The man who built it was a remarkable man. Before he left, the doctor handed her a small package. "The Evans family left this for you, and Jed at the livery says to tell you your debt is paid in full. Says your story is worth more than $10 to this town." Inside the package was a bolt of warm wool cloth and a new needle and thread. It was a simple gift, but it meant the world. The final piece of vindication came not with words, but with a silent visit. One afternoon, Rose saw a rider coming up the trail. It was Silas Croft. He didn't approach the cabin, but sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, just looking. He saw the smoke curling from the chimney, the patched roof, the glint of the axe in the chopping block. He saw a home. He saw what he, with all his money and power, had been unable to see. Not a collection of timber and rock, but a life. He had seen the land as a resource to be exploited. She had seen it as a place to belong. After a long moment, he turned his horse and rode away without a word. He never bothered her again. The laughter of the town had turned to whispers of reverence. They didn't understand the full truth, the secret of the letter in the tin box, but they understood the visible evidence of her labor and spirit. The community, which had once cast her out with its scorn, was now slowly, quietly claiming her as one of its own. Spring arrived on the mountain like a whispered promise fulfilled. The snows receded, and the valley floor erupted in a riot of green, dotted with the wildflowers from the seeds Silas Blackwood had left behind. The air was sweet with the smell of damp earth and pine. Rose worked in the small garden she had cleared, turning the rich soil, planting the carrots, beans, and corn, just as the trapper's journal had instructed. She had survived the winter. More than that, she had bloomed. The solitude that had once felt like a heavy blanket was now a comfortable cloak. She was not lonely, for the spirit of Silas Blackwood was in the sturdy walls of the cabin, in the well-balanced handle of the axe, in the quiet wisdom of his words. Her days were filled with the satisfying rhythm of meaningful work, and her nights were filled with the profound peace of the silent, watching stars. One evening, as the sun set, casting the entire valley in a warm, golden light, she stood on the small porch she had rebuilt, looking out over her domain. Jasper the mule stood beside her, his head resting on her shoulder. The world below, the world of towns and auctions and mocking laughter, felt 1,000 miles away. She had arrived here with nothing, a girl defined by what she had lost. But now, standing on this mountain ledge, she was defined by what she had built, what she had nurtured, what she had honored. She ran a hand over the smooth, warm river stone she always kept in her pocket, the one from Blackwood's tin box. The kind doctor had asked her what she thought the old trapper had truly left her. She hadn't had the words then, but she had them now. Looking out at the vast, beautiful, and wild landscape that was now her home, she murmured the words to Jasper, her voice quiet but sure. "He didn't leave me a place," she said. "He left me a chance. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story. It's a powerful reminder that true inheritance is not about what we are given, but about the courage we find to accept it. If you were moved by Rose's journey, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and unexpected grace. We'll see you next time.